You feel lost, not because something has gone wrong, but because something very important has quietly fallen apart inside you. And it didn't happen all at once. It happened slowly, almost politely, so gently that you didn't even notice. One day you were a child, alive in the moment, curious, absorbed in the simple miracle of being here. And then, without realizing it, you were handed a map of how life is supposed to be lived, where to go, what to want, who to become. And from that moment on, you began measuring yourself against an image that was never truly you. This feeling of being lost is not a personal failure. It is not a weakness of character. It is a symptom of living in a world that teaches you to abandon your own center. You were taught to think of life as a journey with a destination, as if the present moment were only a waiting room for something better. And so your mind became obsessed with the future, with improvement, with achievement, with becoming someone else. But in doing so you unknowingly stepped away from the only place where life is actually happening. You see, the strange thing about being lost is that it often appears when you are doing exactly what you were told to do. You followed the rules. You chased the goals. You tried to be productive, responsible, successful. And yet, somewhere along the way, a quiet emptiness appeared. A subtle sense that none of it feels quite real, as if you are watching your own life from a distance, playing a role, performing a script written by someone else. This is because the mind has been trained to split you in two. On one side, there is the image of who you think you should be. On the other, there is the living, breathing reality of who you are right now. And the tension between these two creates anxiety, confusion, and a constant sense of dissatisfaction. You are always slightly ahead of yourself, chasing an idea, while life continues to unfold behind you. The mind loves to label this state as being lost, but lost compared to what? Lost compared to an imagined path that was never guaranteed in the first place. Lost compared to a story that says life should be clear, purposeful, and neatly organized. But nature does not operate that way. Rivers do not worry about where they are going. Trees do not panic, because they do not know what they will look like next year, and yet they grow perfectly well. Your discomfort comes from trying to treat life as a problem to be solved rather than a process to be lived. You were taught that uncertainty is dangerous, that not knowing is a flaw. But in reality, not knowing is the natural state of existence. The universe itself does not have a final plan written down somewhere. It unfolds, experiments, explores, and you are not separate from that process. You are it. When you say, "I don't know what I'm doing with my life," what you really mean is, I can no longer pretend that the old answers work. And that is not a crisis. That is an awakening, even if it feels uncomfortable. The sense of being lost is the mind loosening its grip on false certainty. It is the collapse of an outdated identity. But the ego resists this collapse. It wants direction, labels, titles, guarantees. It wants to be someone solid and definable. So when those structures begin to fall apart, it panics. It tells you that you are behind, that you are wasting time, that others have figured it out while you have not. But this comparison is an illusion. Everyone is improvising. Some are simply better at hiding it. You are not meant to have your life figured out in advance. That idea itself is what creates the suffering. Life is not a straight line. It is more like music. You don't ask where a melody is going. You listen to it as it unfolds. The moment you stop listening and start demanding a destination, the music loses its meaning. The feeling of being lost is actually a signal that you are standing at the edge of something honest. The old masks no longer fit. The borrowed ambitions feel heavy, and for the first time you are close enough to yourself to feel the discomfort of living out of alignment. This is not something to escape from. This is something to understand, Because the moment you stop trying to force meaning onto your life, something very surprising happens. You begin to notice that life already has a rhythm. Your breath moves on its own. Your heart knows how to beat without instructions. Awareness itself is effortlessly present. You don't have to earn it. You don't have to chase it. It is already here. And perhaps the deepest reason you feel lost is because you have been looking for yourself in the wrong place. You have been searching in thoughts, roles, achievements, and future plans. But the one who is aware of feeling lost is not lost at all. That awareness is stable, silent, and always present beneath the noise of the mind. So before you rush to fix yourself, before you demand answers, before you try to become someone else, pause. Notice the simple fact that you are here, listening, breathing, aware. The ground you are standing on is far more solid than the mind wants you to believe. This is not the end of your confusion, but it is the beginning of seeing it differently. And that changes everything. Once you begin to see that the feeling of being lost is not an enemy but a message, your relationship with it starts to change. Instead of asking, "How do I get rid of this feeling?" you begin to ask, "What is it trying to show me?" And that question alone shifts you out of panic and into curiosity, because panic comes from believing that something essential is missing, while curiosity arises when you sense that something important is unfolding. The mind has a habit of turning life into a courtroom. It constantly judges where you are versus where you think you should be. It brings up evidence from the past and anxieties about the future, and then declares a verdict, not enough, too late, off track. But this entire trial takes place in thought. Reality itself is far quieter. Reality simply is. It does not accuse you of anything. You feel lost because you are trying to stand on ideas instead of experience. Ideas about success. Ideas about purpose. Ideas about identity. But ideas are unstable ground. They change with culture, with age, with comparison. Experience, on the other hand, is always real. Right now is real. The sound of this voice is real. The sensation of being alive in this moment is real. And yet the mind keeps pulling you away from this solidity into imaginary futures and rewritten pasts. There is a subtle fear underneath the feeling of being lost, and it is the fear of letting go of control. Because if you are not following a clear plan, then who is in charge? If there is no defined path, then what are you supposed to do? The ego does not like open-ended questions. It wants certainty because certainty gives it a sense of permanence. But life has never offered permanence. It offers movement. Think about how you learn to walk. No one gave you a 10-year plan. You didn't sit down and analyze the mechanics of balance. You wobbled, you fell, you stood up again. Learning happened through direct participation, not through overthinking. But as you grew older, you were taught to distrust this natural intelligence and replace it with constant mental control. So now, when life asks you to move without guarantees, the mind freezes. It says, "I don't know what to do," when in reality, it means, "I don't know how to predict the outcome." And that uncertainty feels like danger, but uncertainty is not danger. It is freedom without a script. The strange irony is that when you are completely certain about who you are and where you are going, you are no longer alive to possibility. You become mechanical. You repeat patterns. You defend an identity. And slowly life becomes smaller. Feeling lost, on the other hand, cracks the shell. It opens space. It invites something new to emerge, even if you cannot yet name it. You have been taught to believe that purpose is something you must find, like a hidden object, as if somewhere out there is a single correct answer waiting to be discovered. But purpose is not an object. It is an activity. It arises from engagement, from presence, from responding honestly to what is in front of you. When you try to define it too early, you suffocate it. The reason so many people feel disconnected is because they are living in abstraction. They are living as an idea of themselves rather than as a living process. They say, "This is who I am," and then spend their lives defending that statement. But you are not a fixed thing. You are more like a verb than a noun. You are something that is happening, not something that is finished. And when you resist this truth, you suffer, because you try to freeze something that is meant to flow. You try to be certain in a universe that is fundamentally dynamic. The mind calls this instability a problem, but nature calls it life. Notice how the sense of being lost often intensifies when you are alone, in silence, or in moments when distractions fade away. That is not accidental. Silence removes the noise that usually keeps you hypnotized. And when the noise fades, you come face to face with yourself without a storyline. That encounter can feel unsettling because it reveals how much of your identity was built on motion, validation, and distraction. But if you stay with that silence, if you don't immediately escape into explanations or entertainment, something else becomes visible. You begin to sense a deeper intelligence at work. Not an intelligence that gives instructions in words, but one that operates through feeling, intuition, and timing. You realize that you don't actually need to know where your life is going in order to live it fully. The moment you stop demanding that life makes sense according to your mental categories, you begin to sense meaning in places you overlooked before, in simple moments, in ordinary actions, in being present without trying to get somewhere else. And this is deeply unsettling to the ego because it means that meaning is not dependent on achievement. You were never meant to arrive at a final version of yourself. The idea of arrival is what keeps you perpetually dissatisfied, because every time you reach a goal, the mind immediately creates another one, and the chase continues. Feeling lost is often the exhaustion of this endless pursuit. It is the soul saying there must be another way to live. And there is. But it does not begin with answers. It begins with a different way of listening. Listening in this deeper sense does not mean waiting for a voice in your head to tell you what to do. It means paying attention to what is already happening before you try to interpret it. Most people do not actually listen to life. They listen to their thoughts about life. And thoughts are always slightly late. They comment after the moment has passed. They analyze, compare, judge, and predict. But they do not live. When you feel lost, it is often because your attention has been almost entirely absorbed by mental noise. You are constantly narrating your experience instead of inhabiting it. You label your emotions, categorize your progress, and evaluate your worth, all while missing the immediacy of being alive. The more you think about where you are, the further away you feel from it. The mind was never meant to be a master. It is a tool, a beautiful one, but dangerous when it takes control. It can plan, calculate, remember, and imagine, but it cannot tell you how to live meaningfully. Because meaning is not a concept. It is a felt experience. And this is why you can understand everything about your situation and still feel empty. There is a deep misunderstanding at the heart of modern life, and it is the belief that you are separate from the world you are experiencing. You think of yourself as a small subject trapped inside a body, looking out at a vast and often hostile universe. From this perspective, life feels overwhelming, and being lost feels terrifying. But this separation is an illusion created by language and thought. In reality, you are not in the world. You are something the world is doing. Just as waves are not separate from the ocean, you are not separate from the total process of existence. When you truly feel this, even for a moment, the anxiety of being lost begins to dissolve. Because how can you be lost when you are exactly where the universe is expressing itself as you? The reason this insight is so difficult to sustain is because the ego depends on separation. It needs a boundary. It needs a story of me versus everything else. And when that story weakens, the ego interprets it as danger. It tells you that you are disappearing, that you are losing yourself. But what is actually happening is that a false image is dissolving. This is why moments of deep presence can feel both peaceful and unsettling at the same time. There is a quiet joy in them, but also a subtle fear. Because without the usual mental chatter, without the familiar identity, you are not sure who you are anymore. And that uncertainty can feel like being lost, even though it is actually a return. You have been trained to believe that you must define yourself in order to exist. Your job, your beliefs, your goals, your personality traits, all of these become anchors for the ego. But these anchors are not who you are. They are roles you play in different contexts. When life begins to change and these roles no longer fit, the ego panics. It says, if I am not this, then what am I? But that question cannot be answered by the mind. It can only be lived. The attempt to intellectually grasp yourself is like trying to bite your own teeth or see your own eyes without a mirror. The one who is searching is the thing being searched for, and until this is seen, the feeling of being lost continues. The irony is that the more desperately you try to find yourself, the more you reinforce the illusion that you are missing. Searching assumes absence, but you are not absent. You are present as the awareness of searching. This is why every answer the mind comes up with eventually feels unsatisfying, because you are not a problem to be solved. Consider how much of your life is spent preparing to live. You plan, you worry, you rehearse, you imagine outcomes, and yet life only ever happens now. The future you are preparing for never arrives as an experience. It arrives only as another present moment. So when you postpone your sense of meaning to a future version of yourself, you are chasing a mirage. Feeling lost is often the realization, conscious or not, that you have been living in anticipation rather than participation. You have been waiting for permission to feel whole, waiting for the right conditions, waiting to become someone worthy of presence, but presence does not wait. It is always available, even in confusion, even in doubt. The discomfort you feel is not because something is wrong with you. It is because something is right and unfamiliar. You are beginning to sense the limits of the old way of seeing yourself. And when a worldview begins to break down, it does not collapse politely. It creates uncertainty, vulnerability, and a feeling of standing on empty ground. But that empty ground is not nothingness. It is openness. It is the space in which something more honest can emerge. The problem is not that you feel lost. The problem is that you have been taught to fear being lost, instead of understanding it as a natural phase of transformation. When you stop resisting this phase, when you allow yourself to not know, something softens. The tight grip of the mind relaxes, and in that relaxation you may notice brief moments of clarity, not about what to do with your life, but about how to be in it. And that distinction changes everything. How to be in life is a question the mind rarely asks, because it is too busy asking what to do with life, and yet the quality of how you are determines the meaning of whatever you do. You can pursue the most impressive goals and still feel empty if you are not present while pursuing them. Or you can engage in the simplest activity and feel deeply alive if your attention is fully there. The sense of being lost often comes from confusing movement with direction. You may be busy, active, productive, and still feel completely disconnected. That is because movement without awareness does not lead anywhere meaningful. It simply creates momentum, and momentum can carry you very far from yourself. When awareness returns, even briefly, you may notice something surprising. The pressure to figure everything out begins to loosen, not because answers suddenly appear, but because the need for answers fades. You realize that much of your suffering came not from uncertainty itself, but from your resistance to it. The ego wants life to be a straight line because straight lines are predictable. But life moves in cycles, waves, and spirals. Sometimes you move forward by standing still. Sometimes you grow by letting something fall apart. From the ego's perspective, this looks like failure or confusion. From a deeper perspective, it is intelligence reorganizing itself. You were taught to trust systems more than yourself. Grades, metrics, timelines, social approval, all of these became substitutes for inner guidance. So when those external structures no longer give you a sense of direction, you feel abandoned. But you were never meant to be guided entirely from the outside. That was always temporary. The inner guidance you are searching for does not speak in sentences. It speaks in sensations, in a quiet pull toward certain experiences, in a subtle resistance to others, in a feeling of expansion or contraction. But to hear it, the mental noise must soften, and that requires patience, not force. This is why trying to fix the feeling of being lost rarely works. The very act of fixing comes from the same mindset that created the problem. It assumes that you are broken and need to be adjusted. But what if you are not broken at all? What if you are simply shedding an identity that no longer fits? There is a grief in this process that is rarely acknowledged. You are not just losing clarity, you are losing familiar versions of yourself. Dreams you once believed in, roles you once played with certainty, expectations others had of you, and expectations you had of yourself. Letting go of these things can feel like losing ground, even when it is actually creating space. The mind interprets this grief as a sign that something has gone wrong. But grief is a natural response to change. It does not mean you are failing. It means you are human, and avoiding this grief only prolongs the confusion. Allowing it, on the other hand, allows movement. There is a profound difference between drifting unconsciously and floating consciously. One feels like being lost. The other feels like trust. The external situation may look exactly the same, but the inner relationship to it is completely different. Trust does not mean believing that everything will turn out according to your preferences. It means being open to whatever unfolds without closing your heart. When you begin to live this way, you may notice that life starts to respond differently. Not because the world has changed, but because you are no longer fighting it. Opportunities appear not as grand revelations, but as small, almost ordinary invitations. A conversation, an interest, a curiosity, a moment of resonance. And instead of asking where it will lead, you simply engage. This is how direction actually emerges, not from thinking your way forward, but from participating fully in what is here. The path is made by walking, not by imagining. And the more present you are, the clearer each next step becomes, even if the whole journey remains unknown. The feeling of being lost begins to transform at this point. It no longer feels like emptiness. It feels like openness, a kind of spaciousness in which you are no longer confined to a single story about who you must be. And while this can still feel uncomfortable at times, it is also deeply liberating. You begin to sense that life is not asking you to become someone specific. It is asking you to be responsive, to be awake, to meet each moment honestly without dragging the past into it or demanding the future conform to it. And slowly, almost without realizing it, the question changes. It is no longer, what am I supposed to do with my life? It becomes, how fully am I willing to live it? When you begin to ask how fully you are willing to live, rather than what you are supposed to become, something subtle but powerful shifts. Life stops feeling like an exam you must pass, and starts feeling like a conversation you are already part of. You are no longer standing outside yourself, evaluating every move. You are inside the experience, responding as it unfolds. Much of the feeling of being lost comes from treating life as a performance. You are constantly imagining an audience, society, family, peers, even an imagined future version of yourself, and trying to live up to their expectations. But when you live for an audience, you are never truly present. You are always slightly elsewhere, adjusting, correcting, anticipating judgment. This creates a strange form of loneliness. You may be surrounded by people and still feel unseen because no one is actually meeting the real you. They are meeting the version you present. And over time, even you forget who you are beneath the presentation. The feeling of being lost is often the pain of this disconnection becoming impossible to ignore. The ego thrives on comparison. It measures your life against other lives and declares winners and losers. But comparison only works if life is a competition, and life is not a competition. There is no finish line where everyone's worth is tallied up. The moment you see this clearly, much of the pressure you carry begins to dissolve. You may notice that some of the people who appear most confident are also the most rigid. They cling tightly to an identity, a belief system, a sense of superiority or certainty. This rigidity gives the appearance of direction, but it often hides fear. The fear of not knowing, the fear of being open, the fear of falling apart. Feeling lost, by contrast, means you are not completely numbed. It means you are sensitive enough to feel the mismatch between who you are and who you are pretending to be. And sensitivity, though uncomfortable, is a sign of aliveness. The mind will try to convince you that you need to rebuild your identity as quickly as possible. It will say, choose something, commit, define yourself, get back on track. But rushing to redefine yourself often leads you back into another borrowed role, another mask, another story that eventually feels just as hollow. There is wisdom in waiting without waiting for anything, in allowing the fog to be there without demanding it lift on your schedule, because clarity that is forced is fragile. Clarity that emerges naturally is stable. In this space of not knowing, you may begin to notice how much of your life has been driven by fear disguised as ambition. Fear of being left behind, fear of being insignificant, fear of not mattering. These fears quietly shape your choices, pushing you toward goals that look impressive, but feel empty once reached. When these fears loosen their grip, your motivation changes. You are no longer driven by the need to prove yourself. You are drawn by genuine interest. Curiosity becomes your compass, and curiosity does not need a 5-year plan. It moves one step at a time, responding to what feels alive. This is why trying to discover your entire life purpose at once is so overwhelming. You're asking a single moment to justify your entire existence. But life does not work that way. Meaning is created locally, moment by moment, through attention and care. It is not delivered as a grand revelation. As you become more present, you may find that the feeling of being lost still appears from time to time, but it no longer carries the same weight. It is no longer an identity. It is simply a passing state, like weather. And just as you do not blame the sky for being cloudy, you stop blaming yourself for not always knowing. There is a quiet confidence that arises from this acceptance. Not the confidence of having answers, but the confidence of being able to meet experience without collapsing. You trust yourself not because you know what will happen, but because you know you can respond. And in this trust, something deeply human returns. Playfulness. Experimentation. the willingness to try, to fail, to change direction without interpreting it as a disaster, life becomes less about getting it right and more about being real. You begin to see that the idea of being on track or off track only makes sense if there is a predetermined destination. But if life is an unfolding process rather than a fixed journey, then there is no wrong place to be. There is only where you are and how you meet it. And when you truly understand that, the feeling of being lost starts to reveal its hidden gift. It has been loosening your attachment to false certainty, false identity, and false control. It has been guiding you, not away from yourself, but closer. As you come closer to yourself, you may notice something unexpected. The world does not suddenly become easier. Problems do not magically disappear. Uncertainty does not vanish. But your relationship to all of it changes. And that change makes all the difference. You stop seeing difficulty as a sign that you are doing life wrong, and start seeing it as part of the texture of being alive. The mind often imagines peace as a state where nothing is wrong, but such a state has never existed. Even in nature there is constant tension, growth and decay, creation and destruction, order and chaos. Peace is not the absence of movement, it is the ability to move without resistance, and resistance is what has been exhausting you. You have been fighting your own experience, fighting confusion, fighting doubt, fighting moments of stillness as if they were wasting time. But stillness is not the enemy of progress. It is the ground from which clarity grows. Without stillness, all movement is blind. This is why the feeling of being lost often appears right before a significant inner shift. It is the pause between identities, the space where the old story no longer works, but the new one has not yet formed. The mind dislikes this space because it cannot control it. But life uses this space to reorganize itself. Think of how a forest regenerates after a fire. To the untrained eye, it looks like devastation. But beneath the surface, new life is already preparing to emerge. The fire clears what can no longer grow. Feeling lost performs a similar function. It burns away assumptions, attachments, and illusions that were limiting your aliveness. The danger is not being lost. The danger is rushing to escape the feeling before it has finished its work. When you prematurely fill the emptiness with distractions, explanations, or rigid beliefs, you interrupt the process. You trade depth for comfort, and comfort, though pleasant, rarely leads to transformation. There is a deep courage in allowing yourself to not know who you are becoming. It requires letting go of the need to be admired, understood, or validated at every step. It means trusting that your worth is not dependent on having a clear direction. This trust does not come from positive thinking or affirmations. It comes from direct experience, from seeing again and again that you can survive uncertainty, that you can feel confusion without disappearing, that you can rest in the unknown and still function, still care, still love. As this trust grows, the voice of urgency in your mind begins to soften. You no longer feel pressured to turn your life into something meaningful. You realize that meaning is not something you manufacture. It is something you notice when you are present. You may also begin to sense how much of your suffering was created by time. Not time as measured by clocks, but psychological time, the constant mental movement between past regret and future hope. When attention returns to the present, much of that suffering loses its foundation. The present moment is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It is simple, ordinary, almost invisible, and yet it is the only place where life actually happens. When you stop demanding that it be more than it is, it reveals a quiet completeness. This does not mean you stop planning or caring about the future. It means you stop living in it. Plans become flexible tools rather than sources of identity. Goals become directions, not measures of self-worth, and failure loses its power to define you. You begin to understand that you were never meant to be a finished product. You were meant to be a process, and processes are not supposed to make sense all the time. They are meant to be lived. The sense of being lost may still visit you occasionally, but it feels different now. It feels like a reminder rather than a threat. A reminder to return, to soften, to listen, to stop gripping life so tightly. And in those moments, you may notice something quietly beautiful. Even without answers, even without a clear map, you are still here, breathing, aware, participating in the mystery of existence. And that, when fully seen, is not a problem at all. It is a privilege. There comes a moment, sometimes quietly, sometimes after long struggle, when you realize that the question was never meant to be answered in the way you were asking it. You were not meant to solve your life like a puzzle. You were meant to live it like a story that unfolds only by being told. The feeling of being lost no longer feels like a flaw to correct. It feels like a sign that you have stepped out of illusion and into honesty. You are no longer pretending to know what you do not know, and that honesty, though uncomfortable, is a form of clarity. You begin to see that much of your suffering came from trying to stand outside life and control it, rather than standing within it and participating. You wanted certainty before engagement, security before movement, answers before experience. But life offers these things only after you step forward, not before. The mind once demanded guarantees. Now it learns to be a companion rather than a commander. It still thinks, plans, and imagines, but it no longer dominates. Awareness takes the lead, and awareness does not rush. It does not panic. It watches, listens, responds. You may notice that the idea of finding yourself starts to sound strange. Because you were never missing, what was missing was attention, presence, the willingness to be with yourself without judgment or agenda. When you stop searching for yourself as an object, you begin to live as the subject, not the subject of a story you are trying to perfect, but the living center of experience itself. And from that center, life feels less like a problem and more like a dance. There is no final arrival here, no permanent state of enlightenment or clarity. There will still be confusion. There will still be doubt. There will still be moments when the old feeling returns and whispers that you are lost again. But now you recognize it. You do not panic. You do not run. You listen. And often beneath that feeling you discover something familiar, a quiet invitation to return to the present, to release another layer of false certainty, to let life move you rather than forcing it into shape. You begin to trust the rhythm of your own existence, not because it is predictable, but because it is real. You stop measuring your life against imaginary standards and start meeting it on its own terms. What once felt like emptiness now feels like space. What once felt like confusion now feels like openness. And what once felt like being lost now feels like standing at the center of something vast and alive. You realize that meaning was never hiding in the future. It was never waiting at the end of a path. It was always woven into the act of being present, into listening, into feeling, into responding honestly to what is. And so the journey does not end with a conclusion. It ends with a relationship with uncertainty, with change, with yourself. One that is no longer based on fear but on curiosity, no longer on control but on trust. You are not late, you are not behind, you are not broken. You are here, and that has always been enough.